It's really exciting to be down here. It's exciting to be in a room full of farmers, to be in a room full of growers who are interested in learning about some different things. I've talked before up in North Dakota. My past, I was working for NDSU as a agronomy research specialist, and part of my project and part of my job was working with intercropping specifically. However, I eventually took that off of the research farm and started implementing it on my own farm, and that's how much I believe in this practice. But anyways, there are innovative farmers up in North Dakota, but there's also a lot of really big farmers who it's hard to change and it's hard to adapt. So I like to go around and I like to share our experience, share our journey with kind of where we started, because we started really small and we've grown to where we're at right now, a little under 1,000 acres. We've got about 750 that we're cropping right now. But in order to understand a little more about how we got to where we are today, felt like I needed to share a little more. Oops, got stuck. Okay, share a little more about who I am in particular. For instance, I am not a farm kid. I did not grow up on the farm. My dad didn't hand me the keys to the tractor and say, here you go, keep the farm going. I was the son of a military father, so I moved around. By the time that I graduated high school, I lived in 7 different states. So I got to kind of explore the countryside, north to south, east to west. You name it, I've probably been there at some point. However, growing up, my passion was to be a farmer. I don't know where it really started from or how it was there, but I knew that that was what I wanted to do. When people would ask me what my career decision was, I wanted to farm. And part of that inspiration was 2 men who are very important to me. My great-grandpa Anderson in the lower left, and then my great-uncle Leon in the bottom. They're both farmers who grew up in the same neck of the woods in North Dakota that I did. So whenever we would move around, we would always go back and we would visit the farms. And those are the happiest parts of my life, was being able to be back, being on the farm. And so in 2011, I graduated high school. I wasn't sure how I was going to make it work or what I was going to do, but I headed off to North Dakota. I started going to school, WSC, Williston State College, for a degree in agriculture, and then I moved over to NDSU, where I finished with my bachelor's in agronomy. And I wasn't really sure how I was going to start farming the land, but I got a job with NDSU working at one of their research farms. And while I started working there, I was given an opportunity to start renting some farmland of my own, and we started on 45 acres. Before I moved over to Fargo and then back to Williston, I had met my wife at the junior college. She was from that same area. So when I moved back to Williston, it was partly to go work for this research farm, but also because that was where my wife was from and I wanted to settle down there. So clicker doesn't, there we go. So we got married in 2016. And when we got married, we actually bought a small little farmstead outside of the biggest city is Williston. We bought a little farmstead outside of Williston. It needed a lot of work, needed to be cleaned up, buildings knocked down, grass mowed, and so we set out with that goal in mind, that this was how we were going to start. And at that same time, we were renting 45 acres. We started farming according to how everybody else was telling us how we needed to farm. Oh, you need to do this. You should try this, and you need to farm this way. And so that's how we started. So we started with a cultivator and a two-wheel drive tractor, and we started tilling, and that was how we got going. That was what was available to us as well. But as we got into our journey, as we started to get a couple more seasons under our belt, we realized that, you know, the way that we're doing this isn't going to be sustainable for us. We're not going to be able to keep up on our operation if we keep doing this. So we made a decision early on that we needed to start figuring out how to work with the ground and not against the ground. We needed to figure out how to have the soil and the land work with us. So we adopted this motto of farming with the land, because we wanted to start utilizing systems, start utilizing practices that were advantageous and gave us kind of a head start, and so that we weren't constantly fighting. Because I think sometimes we get stuck in this headspace of, well, this is how it's always been done, so I'm just going to keep doing it, and we don't stop and we don't realize that, well, maybe there's a reason why I'm dealing with this issue. So we started farming with the land. And that eventually led us to realizing that we needed to take a leap of faith. Now, our faith is instrumental and is foundational to our farm and to our whole setup. Without our faith, without our belief system, then I don't think we would have made some of the adjustments that we've had. But I remember it was in between 2017 and 2018. I think it might have been like January or something. I was at a conference at something that was being put on by North Dakota, and we brought in a researcher from southern Canada, Lana Shaw. And she was speaking about this practice called intercropping, and talking about some of the research that they had been doing in Canada, sharing some of the results of how it was working, what they were able to use, and what they were seeing. And I remember as I was sitting there listening to her share, that it clicked. That all of a sudden I was like, you know what? I can do this. This makes sense. There's a lot about what she was doing and about how she was saying that things were interacting together that just made sense. And I remember sitting there going like, I'm going to do this. And my dad was visiting us at the time, and he was at the same event. And I remember looking over at him and telling him like, hey Dad, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to try this. I don't know how it's going to work, but I know that I'm going to try it. We're going to implement this somehow. And I remember that he kind of was like, well, but you're in an area where you don't have a lot of rainfall. Our average annual precipitation in our little neck of the woods is anywhere from 8 inches to 12 inches on a yearly basis. So we don't have a lot of rain. We can't depend on it. And I remember him saying that, well, you don't have a lot of rain. Maybe this is a practice that you kind of put in your back pocket for a year that looks like you're going to have optimal conditions, that you're going to have everything that lines up. And I remember thinking like, that doesn't make any sense. If I'm going to wait for optimal conditions, then I'm just going to keep waiting. Eventually, I have to just make a jump. Eventually, I had to do this. And I also got to thinking that at the size of our operation, we're at about 60 acres at this point now, that if we don't do this now, then we're going to get to a point where we're going to be too big, or it's not going to seem feasible to do this. So now is the time to start. Now is the time to try something to see if this actually does work. And as we got involved, as we started taking that next step, I started to meet a few different people. One of the people that I met was Jay Fear, and he shared with me the soil health principles. And I remember visiting Minokin Farm and just seeing how everything worked together, how there was this integration of the land working with Jay and working for Jay, and it just made sense. So we we started diving into these soil health principles a little bit. And my graphic here is a little bit on the older side. I'm using a one that only has the five principles rather than the 6 principles. However, I like this graphic because it shows that everything's in a cycle. It's not just a step-by-step process. You complete step 1, you move to step 2. But everything is in a cycle, everything is working together, and like a wheel, it just kind of goes around. So how do these principles apply on our farm? Well, first off, the first principle that was added here, and let's see if it's going to move on me. The first principle that was added here not that long ago was know your context. And I remember thinking that when this one came out, that this didn't really make a lot of sense. I liked the old 5 principles. I wasn't really a fan of this 6th principle. The reason being was all the other 5 principles were calls to action, calls to things that you could actually physically do and implement on your operation in order to improve the soil. Whereas knowing your context didn't really make a lot of sense to me. But as I've thought about it more and as I've had an opportunity to actually take a look at it, this one makes the most sense because you have to understand your context. You have to understand your environment, your capabilities, your limitations in order to know where exactly you can go. By knowing your context, you have a little bit of a roadmap in order to move forward. So our particular context was that we were a very small fish in a very large pond. Our neighbors to the north, south, east, and west of us are all farming anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 plus acres. They're all no-tilling. They're all just conventional monocropping, trying to get as much yield, trying to push the envelope on the yield as much as possible. The second thing about our context was that first 45 acres that we rented was not a good chunk of ground. It had a southwest facing slope and it dried out very quick. Had a sand base to it and it did not hold a lot of water. So that first year that we went and we cultivated it, we didn't do ourselves any favors at all. In fact, we shot ourselves in the foot, and it has taken us a long time to get that field back to a point where we're actually able to get a pretty decent stand and a pretty decent crop off of that field. So we realized that the ground that we were given, the ground that we started on, we needed to implement practices that helped us. And then a long-term goal of my wife and I that we're still kind of figuring this one out. We're trying to figure out where it's going to go, what it's going to look like exactly. But we have this desire to reduce a lot of our inputs because we're constantly being told, put more on, just put more on. But we're also seeing a lot of negative benefits by putting more on. And not only on the land, but in the financial pocketbook too. So we've actually taken a step on our farm and we have reduced a few inputs. We've cut out fungicide and we've cut out insecticides. We're not going to use those on our farm anymore. We will still use herbicides. We're looking at some options of, are there ways that we can maybe even reduce that a little bit more? We're trying to reduce some of our synthetic fertility by utilizing other systems, by utilizing crop rotations. And next, we had to integrate. We currently don't have cattle or livestock on our land. We're having some issues with accessibility on our land to be able to make that work. We don't have good water sources nearby that we can feasibly run cows right now. So instead, we started looking at what other systems are available in nature that we could implement. And well, one of those systems that we saw was that if you look out in a natural grass prairie land, you see a diverse mixture of grasses and forbs. You don't just see one dominant grass species or one forb species taking over the landscape. but you see everything intermingling, working and growing together. And so this fit into that idea of intercropping. If nature's doing it, if God has created it that way, why can't we utilize something similar on our own cropland? And next, we realized that we needed to minimize. And as I mentioned, we cultivated that first year, and that was also the last year that we cultivated. The next year, we made a move to a we made a move to a hoe drill. So we were still doing some soil disturbance. We had minimized what we had been doing, but at the same time that we were disturbing the soil, we were also planting a seed so that we could get growth immediately, or somewhat quickly comparatively. In 2022, we were able to purchase our first no-till drill, and since then we haven't looked back. The amount of residue that we've been able to maintain on our land has been just phenomenal. And residue is very important for us out in western North Dakota. The wind really likes to blow. So if you don't have something anchoring that soil down, it's going to be gone. And NDSU recently published a study where the title of their study was that if you lose 6 inches of topsoil, that could cost you $6,600. Well, I don't have 6 inches worth of topsoil to lose. So I had to break it down into losing 1 inch, $1,100. I mean, that's still an incredible amount. So why are we willing? Why am I willing? Why should I be willing to lose my ground? I don't want to lose that. Next, we decided we needed to maximize. So that first field that we took over, as I mentioned, it was wheat, and it was a wheat fallow system. So one of the first decisions that we made was, well, we're going to switch the rotation up a little bit. So we made sure to get some pulses in there. We also tried soybeans a little bit on that piece. That one kind of bit us in the butt, but we've learned from that and have moved forward. But anyways, we decided we needed to further maximize. We needed to figure out, how do we get a root in the ground as long as possible with as short a season as we have? How do we incorporate more of what we see going on in the nature around us? How do we get that on our field? And so that's where intercropping falls in for us, is it gives us a maximization in our land. It maximizes our crops on that particular piece. It maximizes some of our efficiency as well. And this is an article that I came across shortly after we started, and it has really just stuck with me for a long time. Because the more my wife and I looked at this, the more we realized that, if we keep doing some of the things that we're doing, some of the ways that we were told to farm, this is going to be us. And similarly, I read a book by J.I. Rodale, Pay Dirt, where he talks heavily about how we have become dependent, or we are close to becoming dependent on outside inputs rather than focusing on what is actually going on with the ground. And so those have both been very influential in our journey forward. So now we're going to jump into the fun part and start talking a little bit about intercropping. Now that you know kind of who I am, where we've started, where we're going. But intercropping. How many are familiar with intercropping or have heard of it before? Okay, well that's a pretty good show of hands. It means us getting around. Well, the basic understanding is any time that you're growing 2 or more species in a landscape together, that can be a form of intercropping. It's nothing that's new. If you go back into history, you can find documentation of Romans practicing it, the Egyptians practicing it, and the Native Americans practicing it. And I actually say that there's varied forms of intercropping that happen. By this definition, we can consider cover cropping or planting a multi-species cocktail a form of intercropping. It's got a different purpose, maybe, but we can consider that. Same with growing for a forage. For growing, like in my neck of the woods, I've got farmers who grow barley and peas together and they're cutting it for hay. That can be a form of intercropping because we've got two root species in the ground. Relay intercropping, where we're planting a fall seeded plant and then planting something in the spring and then harvesting them separately. So we've got two planting passes and two harvest passes. But what we've implemented on our farm is something that I've started to call a mixed grain intercropping, where we've got one planting pass, one harvest pass, and then we're doing a post-harvest separation. So today, that's what I'm going to focus on, is the mixed grain intercropping. And as I mentioned, the Native Americans utilized something called the Three Sisters. And the Three Sisters was a planting form where they would take a mound of dirt, they would take corn, plant that in the middle, put beans around the corn, and then put the squash around the hill. And each one of those plants was planted with an intended purpose, a way to benefit the others that were already there. So the corn would grow up, the beans needed something to trellis and needed something to hold them up, so the corn was there to hold the beans up. The beans would put a little bit of nitrogen back in the ground for both the squash and the corn, and then the squash would provide a little bit of natural defense against some of the predators around, as well as receive shade from the corn and the beans. And interestingly enough, I gave this talk or a similar talk yesterday up down in Wichita, and after I had somebody who was actually from Newtown, North Dakota, approach me. She works on the affiliated tribes, and she said that they're working with something called the Four Sisters, where they implemented sunflower into the system in order to bring in beneficial insects. So our next, the next reason, the next thing that we had to consider of why we were going to intercrop, why were we going to try to make this work? Well, we wanted to have the land work with us, but ultimately it came down to our kids and our family. We wanted to be able to have something workable to be able to hand down to them. We didn't want to hand them a problem, but we wanted to give them something that they could look forward to. And so when we intercrop, you have to have a strategy. You have to have some sort of game plan in mind. We can't just go out there and throw two seeds in the ground and hope that that's going to work out. I once had one of the NDSU events I spoke at, I asked about who was familiar with intercropping, and one farmer raised his hand and he said, well, I did that one time and I got rejected at the elevator. And I said, well, what were you growing? And he said, well, I had barley and wheat together. Like, that doesn't make any sense. But so we have to have some sort of strategy in order to make this work. If we don't have a game plan, then we're not going to score a touchdown, we're not going to score a first down or get a first down. So in our working with, we've kind of come up with 3 principles that we try to live by when deciding what we're going to intercrop together. They have to have plants that are similar in maturity. Usually I look for something that's about a 7 to 10 day window from one another. I also want to find something that's got very different seed sizes. Because if you've got a couple of, for example, the first year that we tried intercropping, we tried durum and peas together. It looked good, but it was really awful to try and separate. We had a lot of cracked peas that ended up with our durum. We didn't end up with 2 good crops like what we were aiming for. So we need seeds that are very different in size, and then they need to be easy to separate. And I know our parents, and as parents, we're told not to pick a favorite child or or say that we've got one over or that we favor one over the other. But in an intercrop system, you have to have a winner. Because having a winner, tailoring your system to one of those two species will give you better direction of how to make some of the other decisions. If you don't have an idea of whether you're going to favor, say, the mustard or the peas in the system, well, it kind of leaves the door open for a lot of decisions that might not go exactly the way you plan. And some of the guys that I've talked to and myself, when I don't have a plan in place, when I don't have a clear destination of I want more mustard at the end of this season, you kind of end up a little disappointed because you weren't sure what your goal was. So we have to have a goal in mind. Pick a winner. Another aspect to consider would be planting configuration. An alternating row pattern or a mixed row pattern where you have everything growing together. And I've seen both of these work. I've seen advantages to both. I've seen a couple of disadvantages on some, but I've seen advantages to both, and it really just comes down to your context, your system, what makes sense. For us, we've employed an alternating row pattern. An alternating row pattern allows us to plant our mustard at that 1/2 inch depth and then our peas closer to that 2 inch depth, which gives us now the optimal conditions for each of those seeds to get a start. Whereas in a mixed system, you're going to have to compromise on that a little bit. You're going to have to plant your mustard a little bit deeper and your peas a little bit shallower. A mixed row system has the advantage of there's very little space where you can see the ground. Whereas in an alternating row pattern, you might see a little bit more ground right away, just because of how wide or how some of those plants work and grow together. The next thing is our current equipment is not necessarily set up in order to do some of these practices. Our current equipment, there might be some limitations, so we have to be willing to make modifications. And that was something that we learned early on, was that we needed to, in order to achieve the goals that we wanted in this system, we had to make some changes. On the left, that John Deere rig there, that was the first air seeder that we got that we replaced our cultivator with. It was supposed to be a 775 John Deere, but I think it was more an experimental unit because whenever I went in for parts, the parts didn't match that whatsoever. So I had to do a lot of my own work to make it happen. But one of the things that helped with was in making the modifications. It forced me to think outside the box, like, okay, how do I make this work? And we were able to rig this up to plant at our alternating row pattern. We have since moved to our no-till rig, and Case didn't realize it, but they were ahead of the curve on the intercropping game because the way they set up their drill was they've got a front rank and a rear rank, and they've got a set of 4 towers on the front and a set of 4 towers on the back. Well, that instantly, with a little bit of configuration, allowed us to get to that alternating row pattern again, to where we could plant our seeds at our optimal depth. And one of those changes that we had to make, Case is using an old rebranded Flexicoil cart, at least the one that we have, and in order to get to where we could use the front rank alone or the rear rank alone, we had to make some changes on our metering wheels. So the middle wheel is for the front rank and for feeding the peas, but if I just wanted to feed the rear rank, it wasn't set up to where I could feed just that set of tubes, so I had to make a little bit of adjustment, and Gorilla Tapes works wonders in that situation. And another question that I get a lot, let's see, here we go, is harvest. What does harvest look like when it comes to an intercrop system? Well, these are 3 videos, and this one is just kind of showing just the amount of material that we're combining through. This is in 23, and it looks primarily dominant of mustard, but there's quite a few peas that are hiding below the canopy that you can't see. And if you're familiar with a, let's see here, with a pea field, you'll notice that there's a lot more residue on this field than if this was a truly straight pea field. Planting mustard with our peas allows the peas to have something to canopy up and to hold that bottom pod a little higher off the ground so we can raise our cutter bar a little higher. And in my neck of the woods, I have a lot of rocks. We sit right where the glacier used to sit in North Dakota, so we have rocks everywhere. We do go out and we roll our ground after we plant it, especially if we're doing peas or something, but I still like to be able to lift my cutter bar off the ground. And so having mustard in the system allows us to lift that cutter bar up a little bit, but it also provides us some residue for after harvesting. Because now, rather than having just a bare pea field, I've got something that's holding that soil in place. And this is just a video showing everything in the grain tank. The darker brown color, that was actually the peas. And then you can kind of see, maybe not so much on this screen, but you can kind of see the white or yellowish color, that would be the mustard. So they all mix together, and it's actually kind of neat to watch them flow together. But in an intercropping system, we have to have a way to separate. We have to realize that separation needs to be one of the key points. If you don't have an idea of how to separate or a way to separate, well, it doesn't work out real well. So we've done a couple of different forms of separation. We've been using a Cook Clean grain cleaner, which has a set of 5 augers and then some perforated tubes that cleans out anything that's smaller than that. So in this case, we're cleaning peas and flax, and we're using a 7/64 sized screen, and we clean out the flax. That goes off on the trash auger, and then the peas go out over the front. We've done separation where we've separated immediately off the field going into the bin, like seen here, or we've separated coming out of the bin later on. It really has come down to kind of where we're at in the middle, at that particular time in harvest. If we need to have trucks running regularly, or if we've got a little bit of time where we can wait. Because when you're running through this cleaning system, that does slow things down a little bit. Over the course of our intercropping journey, we've had a lot of high points, we've had a lot of successes, but we've also had a lot of failures. We've had a lot of times where we've tried something and then we've fallen completely on our face, but even that prompted us to change our mindset. We realized that we couldn't look at those as failures, but more as a challenge and a way to adjust what we were doing. So I'm going to start by taking us kind of through year by year of each of our intercropping mixes, and I'm going to talk a lot about some of the high points, but also some of the failures that happened, and then how we adjusted and readapted for the next year. And so we realized that we had to fail forward. So I did mention that in 2018, we actually planted peas and durum together, and that one didn't really work out for us. So then in 2019, I really kind of considered that the full-on start to our intercropping journey. We decided to go with specialty pea, maple peas, and canola. And By this point, we're farming 60 acres, little more than 60 acres. We had gotten a contract on growing canola, growing a non-GMO canola. So we found a Clearfield canola variety that fit this company's bill. And we planted 45 acres of a monoculture of canola, and then we had 15-ish acres of this peas and canola planted together. And this looked really good. It looked like it was going to be something that we could move forward with. However, a management decision kind of brought us to our knees that first year with this. The decision came down to when we were watching the crops mature. We had the 45 acres of the canola, or we had this intercrop where things were getting close, but they weren't as close as the monocrop canola. So do we start with the canola or do we start on the intercrop? And we made the decision to start with the monocrop and to get that off the field. Well, as I mentioned before, our normal precipitation is anywhere from 8 to 12 inches. That September, in a matter of 2.5 weeks, we had 10 inches of rain. And so by the time that we were done with our monocrop and we're ready to move over to the intercrop was completely flattened. And that was kind of a gut punch. But that made us realize that the next year we needed to, if we truly saw this as something important, as something that we were going to adopt and work with, that's where our priority needed to be. So our mindset changed that our intercrop was now going to be the very first thing that we got in the ground, and it was also going to be one of the first things that we took off. So in 2020, we moved away from the specialty pea market and went back to a dry yellow pea. We stuck with Clearfield canola. Clearfield canola gave us the advantage of being able to apply a broadleaf herbicide if we needed to in this system. This particular year, we decided that we are also going to cut our fertilizer rate. So in North Dakota, they say for peas, a normal planting rate is 180 pounds to the acre. They say for canola, a normal planting rate is 4 pounds to the acre. Canola price at this point, I think, was like 40 cents a pound. So our strategy was we want more canola in the end. So we decided to plant a full rate of canola, 4 pounds to the acre, with only 60 pounds of peas in the system. We also made the decision to cut our fertilizer from what's the recommended rate of 120 pounds of N down to 60 pounds of N. I had a neighbor farmer up the road who planted a monoculture of canola, who planted at full seeding rate, applied all the fertility that was needed, and at the end of the year, he was harvesting about 35 bushel canola, which is very respectable in our area. Down the road, I harvested 25 bushel canola, but I had 16 bushel peas on top of that, and we only used half the amount of nitrogen. So I considered that a win, and I considered that further evidence that this is something that we need to continue doing. We need to figure out how to make this work some more. Well, we didn't realize it, but 2020 was a drought year. The effects of the drought had been masked over by the 10 inches of rain we'd received the previous September, October. But that drought year from 2020 continued on into 2021. And as we realized that it was going to be a really dry one, that there wasn't much hope for rain, input costs were through the roof, we decided we're going to try to cut our fertilizer even more. So we went down to 30 pounds of N to the acre. However, with the drought and that little fertilizer, our canola did not do well in this system. We also had an issue with our planter overseeding that year, to where I should have had enough. By this point, we're up to 120 acres now. I should have had enough to plant 60 acres of an intercrop. Should have had enough canola seed. However, I ran out about halfway through. So then I went back to the farm and I found some flax that I had sitting in a bin from a few years prior where we had done some flax. And so then I took the peas and the flax and tried that as an intercrop. And because of the dry weather, because of the dry year, it looked really good because the maturities looked like they lined up perfect. It looked like it dried down real close to one another. Flax, if you're familiar with that, takes just a little bit of moisture and it'll hold on. It'll continue to try to stay green as long as possible. But because of the dry weather in 21, it looked perfect. So I made the decision in 22, okay, we're just going to move away from canola and now we're going to go to peas and flax. Well, we had just a hair of moisture towards the end of the growing season, to the point that my flax was just starting to turn colors. Things were starting to get mature, but my peas were really progressing really fast through that maturity stage. And so I was getting nervous. So by the time that harvest came, I ended up pushing this system. And I pushed it probably a little too hard. The combine did not like trying to harvest this particular crop. So that led us to pivot away from flax. And in 23, we were able to actually find a couple of contracts. We found a contract on a specialty pea, Austrians, and then a contract on mustard. We kind of looked at canola, but by the time we started looking at canola, it quickly went from 30, 40 cents a pound down to below 20 cents a pound. Whereas then mustard was sitting at that anywhere from 40 to 60 cents a pound. So I started calling around trying to find out who would take mustard, who was close, or who would provide some trucking in order to take mustard. So we found a contract. We contracted both crops. Because we contracted both crops, we decided we are going to split our strategy a little bit. 23 is the first year that we took over our full 750 acres. So we planted 120 of those acres into an intercrop system. And we split it kind of down the middle and said we're going to do 60 acres where mustard's the winner and 60 acres where peas are the winner. And ultimately, I didn't really see a difference in either one. But this system really prompted me to look further at what's going on below ground. Because we didn't apply any fertilizer on this particular mix this year. We decided that we're just going to try it without. We're going to hope that the peas kind of hold us up. And when I went and looked, it was really hard to tell that the mustard was lacking of nitrogen. I know literature kind of tells us that there's not a lot of sharing going on in season between legumes and other crops, but my visual test, my eye observation tells me there's something more there. But 23 had a little bit of a challenging aspect to it in that August 1st we had a hailstorm roll through, and it wiped out a lot of guys. Wiped out a lot of canola, wiped out a lot of wheat. This particular image is my neighbor's canola field and then our intercrop field. These were right across the road from each other, hit with the same storm. When you stood on the road and you looked out, that canola field was white. There were shattered pods all over. It didn't take my neighbor long to get that field combined. He drove through it pretty quick. There wasn't really much of anything left. However, when you went over to our intercrop field, and I still can't really explain this, there was some sort of shielding effect, or the mustard was held on a little better than the canola, because it took you a long time to find shattered pods. You could tell that there were shattered pods in there because you could look on the ground and you could see seeds laying. But that video of us combining, that was from this field. So you could tell there was still a lot out there, and it somehow survived that hailstorm. 23 was also a challenging year because that ground that we had taken over hadn't been managed super well prior to us taking it on. So there was an issue with kochia. And I don't know if you guys have an issue with kochia around here or not. But what we didn't realize was our kochia was resistant to Roundup. And we had to leave a lot of ground, a lot of our wheat ground. We had to cut around big patches because the kochia had outcompeted us. And we weren't able to get a good control on that. But that to go on further with that, in our intercrop system, it actually shaded out a lot of the kochia, except for a few patches where things didn't grow super well. Where we had a good stand of peas and mustard, it shaded out the kochia and stood up very well. But I also look at that intercropping system and think that if we didn't have that in place in that year, we would not have survived with as much ground as we had to leave uncut or cut around. That then prompted us to change some of our strategy for 24. Realizing that we had resistant kochia, we had to move away from Roundup because we needed to do something to give ourselves a little bit of a head start. So I really hate the chemical Gramoxone or Paraquat, but we did make a decision to go and use that as our burn down, just so we could get that kochia under control and we could get our plants growing. But this was 24. We had planted 200 acres, over 200 acres of our intercrop system. And this year we wanted to play around with ammonium sulfate to see if the sulfur would help our mustard any, if there was any advantage to doing that. So we once again split our acres and put AMS on about half, and then we left several fields, but again about half without any AMS. When you went out and looked, there was very little difference, if any, between the fields that had AMS versus the ones that did not. So again, this just goes to show that there is some symbiotic effect. The things are working together and working with one another. 2024 took a gut punch of a turn. So shortly after harvest, we had gotten all of our wheat off, all of our intercrop off. We had soybeans remaining. This is a day, October 5th, where there was winds of 50 to 60 mile an hour sustained with 80 mile an hour gusts. A wildfire started out in the prairie and it took off, and there was absolutely no catching it. And our farm ended up right that white dot, right smack in the middle. Over 90,000 acres burned in one day. And how did this impact our intercrop? Well, it got hot enough around one of our bins where everything that we had stored together, because we were trying to get things off the field and just we were going to worry about the separation after the fact. So we had binned everything together. Well, it got hot enough around one of those bins that when we started pulling out of the bin, it was all black. It had all just got hot enough to where it had burned. So in 24, I didn't have any results to look back as to how we did with mustard versus peas. And then that prompted us in 25 to actually make the decision. We didn't have an intercrop this last year. The reason for that was we had lost all of our residue on our cropland. We watched all winter long as it was all blowing away, and the snow was not sticking, was not holding in place, and we were watching our dirt just fly away. So we made the decision this last year to go back and plant cereals and flax in order to get some sort of stubble to hold our ground in place again. I was a little disappointed in myself for not growing an intercrop in this particular year, but I also watched a bunch of farmers who went and planted, say, canola on burnt ground, and I watched a lot of them have to go and replant that canola because there was nothing there to protect it. So going forward in 26, we're looking at getting back into intercropping again. We'll probably stick with peas and mustard, or we might try something new. But when it comes to an intercropping system, we have to be intimately attached to our ground. We have to realize what's going on, and not necessarily in an intercrop system entirely, just as farmers in general. We need to be intimately attached. We need to see what's going on and take a look at what's happening. One of the observations that we've made with our intercrop ground is that when we put wheat following an intercrop, that's the best wheat that we grow. We've put wheat following our monocrop systems, and we always have to put more nitrogen to it in order to get it to keep up. When we put our wheat on our intercrop grounds, it's some of the most uniform looking wheat that we've had. I really like to take a shovel out with me to the field, and I like to dig down to see what's going on below my feet. I like to look at the earthworms that are crawling around. I like to see what nodules are being developed on my peas. I also like to see how those two root systems are interacting and working with one another. I've just noticed a lot of really cool visual things. I'm going to move past that one. We've done some other things on our farm where we have tried cover crops. We've tried full season cover crops where we plant them in May and then leave them all the way through the growing season, essentially taking that particular field out of production. The reason why we've done that is we're trying to see if we can get some more biomass built up on some of our fields, but we're also trying to give our land a little bit of a break every once in a while. And so we've worked with a few different mixes. We've worked with mixes that are dominant on grasses. We've worked with mixes that are more dominant on legumes. We have tried rye. Our rye was looking really fantastic in 23, and we actually had, out of all the fields that we were dealing with kochia, our best kochia control came in our rye fields. However, that August 1st hailstorm wiped our rye out. Prior to that, we were looking at, my estimation, probably a 60 bushel to the acre crop. And what was cool about that was we didn't get any fertility applied to those rye fields. We ran out of time, and by the time we had gotten to the point of switching around to get the fertilizer spreader going, the rye was already standing this tall, and I didn't really want to start running it down. So we didn't get any fertility applied, but we had heads that were 4 or 5 inches long and just full of seed. So that was a little disappointing to not be able to actually harvest that one and see what it truly could have become. But we're looking forward to the future. We're looking forward to some different things that we can try to adopt. As I've mentioned, we don't have livestock integration on our cropland right now, but we're trying to figure out how to make that happen. We've started raising pigs. We're raising Idaho pasture pigs. And so I would really like to figure out how to get them onto our cropland and get them working with us a little bit. We've attempted some work with manure, trying to apply that. I would like to get back and try it again. I don't know if it really worked for us the one year that we did try it. That was also the year that we made the switch to the no-till drill, so I don't know if we had enough mixing action going on or not. We also want to get into some chickens, and I want to get into chicken tractors. We have a problem with grasshoppers in our area. As I mentioned before, we took insecticides out of our equation. There have been a few times where I've been ready to go and spray an insecticide because I've been watching my neighbors' fields get eat up by grasshoppers, and I've watched the grasshoppers start moving in on the edges of mine. And so I would like to maybe see if we can use chickens to help with that problem a little bit. Even though we aren't putting our pigs directly on our farmland, we're still trying to use some of the same principles in our pig pen, for example. We tried to grow a cover crop in our pig pen, soak up some of the excess moisture, but also give them something a little more to root around in. And it kind of worked. We'll probably mess around with that one a little bit more. It was a little toxic in some areas, as you can see. I also really, I don't know if you've heard of Brendan Rocky. He farms over in Colorado. He farms potatoes. And well, one of the things that I always found really cool about his operation was that he would plant a wildflower strip right down the middle of his fields. And that would establish first, and the beneficial insects would move in there. And then as they got more mature in his potatoes, and he also had some different things growing with his potatoes as well, some other flowering plants. And the beneficials would move from that flower strip out into the rest of his field, helping overall with the system work together. So one of the things that I'm trying to figure out is how do we get some sort of wildflower strip or something similar, maybe using annual flowers in our system, a cover crop along the edge or something, to get some of our beneficials directly into our field. I want to start working with apiaries and get them involved with our intercrop acres. I want to get them where we have bee boxes right on the edge, and we've got the pollinators right there. Biologicals, I'm still trying to figure out. That one, if I'm going to employ something on my farm, I want it to be something that I can see a benefit immediately, or see something that's going to work with my system. So I haven't quite found which biological, or if there is a biological that makes sense for our system. As a result of going down this journey, we've started several social media pages. Yeah, go ahead and follow along. We always try to be transparent about what we're doing and what we're seeing. Again, I really have enjoyed this opportunity to come down here and talk. I hope that you guys were able to pick something out of what I had to say. Thank you. And if there's any questions, I think we've got a little bit of time for that.
I'm wondering, how do you report your acres to FSA?
How do I report my acres to FSA? Oh, that is that's a headache question, because yes, I do. I clearly write on there that it's intercropped with mustard and peas. The issue comes with, how do they certify that? Are they certifying that as the peas, or are they certifying it as the mustard? Well, then I end up having a conversation with my insurance agent. So intercrop acres, you currently cannot insure them. So that is that's a risk that you end up having to take on your own. If you are to intercrop, it's going to be an uninsured acre. So then I have this conversation with my insurance agent of which one he would rather have me certify it as, just so we can keep records going forward. My insurance agent, he is really interested in seeing us progress forward on this journey, so he's really trying to make sure that everything lines up so that in the future, if there are ever any changes, that we're set up in a good position. So yes, reporting to FSA is difficult. because I try to explain to them, they're like, well, is it a 50-50? Like you've got 50 acres of this and 50 acres of that in that same field? I'm like, no, it's not quite like that. But I end up just picking usually one crop or the other to certify. I don't know if that really answers your question or not. But they always kind of groan whenever I come into the office. So
I would say after listening to Jimmy Emmons from Oklahoma talk,
yep.
we've got a tremendous advocate on our side for what you're doing now.
That's good. And I will say that, so I live in Williams County, and we've got an FSA office there, and so that's who I deal with typically. However, we've got Divide County to the north, and there are a couple of producers who are intercropping as well, and how they have their interaction with their FSA office has been very different than my interaction with my FSA office. So it really depends, I think, on who's in that office and how willing they are to kind of figure it out. From my understanding is the Divide County people have been a lot more interested in trying to figure out some of the nuances of how do we actually report this and how do we report this accurately. So I think that there's some potential for change, and I really hope there's some potential for change there.
When you mentioned wheat, I know
Yes.
you mentioned Durham, but you basically spring wheat?
Yes, I made the decision to move to red spring wheat, to hard red, because with that decision that we were going to prioritize our intercrop first, if Durham gets any bit of rain in our environment, we're going to have vomitoxin problems. And so then I have to push to get my Durham off first, which isn't really how I want to do it. And then I also lose color on my Durham. So spring wheat, there's a little bit less that they can dock me for quality wise. So that's where we made the decision to stick with spring wheat rather than Durham in our system. Yes.
Any other herbicide resistant broadleaves besides the kochia?
I haven't noticed any in our particular fields. We've got mare's tail around our area that's resistant to Roundup as well. Our kochia is also becoming resistant to carfentrazone or AIM or Sharpen. Mare's tail is about the only other one that I can think of off the top of my head. We're trying to be aware of Palmer amaranth and kind of where that's at, because we know it's coming.
I've always heard that canola really likes tillage around here. How do you explain it performing in the intercropping system like this?
Well, in our region, all the canola that goes in, and I would say the top three crops in northwestern North Dakota are Durham wheat, lentils, and canola. And I'd say there's probably more canola acres now than there are Durham wheat acres actually. And all of it's no-tilled. I haven't seen any tilled canola in our area. It's all no-tilled and then straight cut. Canola has worked really well in that area, but the one thing that I have started to notice with canola is that it really needs that fertility. So that year that we really cut back in order to try to reduce our inputs even further, I think that was more what hurt us than not, was that the canola just really needed more nitrogen than we had put on. Whereas with the mustard, as I've shown and spoke about a little bit, we've been able to see some years where we haven't put on any fertility and we've just had inoculation on our peas and we've still gotten away with a pretty decent mustard crop. Well, thank you.